Okay, so if we can start just by asking, have you always wanted to work in the IT industry? Was it something, some people I've talked to, school was where they started looking at IT and carried on from there. Others came to it later in life. So yeah, just how and where did you come into the IT industry?
Yeah, sure. As I was coming through school, it wasn't really obvious to me what the IT industry was. I came out of school sort of the mid-80s, and IT as an industry, I think, was quite fledgling then, and certainly wasn't talked about as part of the career prospects. It wasn't an industry that I targeted at that point. I actually started my career, I was always very technical at school. I was really good at the sciences and maths. And so I really started in the electronics industry in Scotland. And I sort of spent a bit of time in the electronics industry before switching into IT. So it was a great basis for that. But I think my perception of the IT industry at that point was very much, it was about coding. And I think there's still a bit of a perception of that today. And that wasn't really something that I was particularly interested in. So I can't say I've always wanted to work in it, but certainly when I moved after working for a few years in electronics, it was an industry that I quickly came to understand and grew really passionate about.
Okay, so what sort of prompted the change from electronics to IT, and then if you can talk us through sort of your career in the IT industry, who types of companies you work for, jobs you've done.
Sure. So my role in the electronics industry was for a very large American company called Wang. They don't exist anymore, but anyone who was sort of around in the 80s and 90s yes, will remember will remember Wang, very well-known brand. And I have to say, coming out of school and being supported through my electronics degree with a company like that was fantastic. I suppose it was a bit like the early stage in the industry of the degree apprenticeships, which, they didn't call it that, but essentially that's what it was. And for me, I think in the electronics manufacturing world, it was I find it quite an insular industry. And by that, you'd be given a design task, you'd go off and work it, and then you come back together as a team. And I really missed the collaboration and engagement with people. That's something that I learned early in my career that I loved doing and was really passionate about. And I think that's part of the IT industry that we don't talk about, is the opportunity for some of the great people that you get to engage with. So whilst I was there, I got a much better understanding of what the IT industry was. And I made a very conscious decision at that point to move out of electronics and more into IT. And to support that, I went off and did a second degree. I did a part-time degree in business studies so that I could augment the technical and electronic knowledge that I had with a bit more commercial business acumen. And in doing that, I was able to secure one of my first IT roles, which was at leading a support team in public sector in Scotland. And my career really has gone from strength to strength in that, moved on into what was Strathclyde Police, running the IT services team. I have to say, a bit of a baptism of fire in terms of operational readiness and response, which was a great grounding. And then moved from there to Intel, and that was when I moved down south from Scotland for my career, was with Intel. And I worked for a division of Intel, which was their data center business. And so I got to understand data centers, managed services, infrastructure as part of that. I did my first exit of a company with Intel. Intel made the decision to sell the data centers to Savis. And so I moved with that exit. I helped support the exit from Intel. and then I did the onboarding into Savis at that point. I spent 9 years in Savis, growing my career, moving through multiple roles and really getting as much commercial and business development experience as I could get that could round off the technical backdrop that I had. And after 9 years, I moved on to Star Internet, a company some people may have come across. Again, PE back, that Star Internet was my first venture into private equity backed organizations. I held a senior level operational management role there, and worked with the leadership team to really ready that business for exit. And that was about restructuring the whole operation, thinking about how we best deliver value and maximize value for an exit on PE. So that was a great first experience, actually, with a great leadership team there. We sold that company to Clarinet, and at that point I moved on to Control Circle. Almost a playbook, repeat and play. Control Circle PE backed by Scottish Equity Partners. Worked with the CEO there to transform operations, drive efficiency, get some foundational tooling in place to get ready for an exit. And we sold that business to Alternative Networks. Stayed in Alternative Networks to do the same for them, integrate some acquisitions that the company had made, and got ready for another exit. And we did the exit of Alternative Networks into Daisy. And I spent a year in Daisy integrating those acquisitions. I then left Daisy and moved to Pulsant. Pulsant were backed by Oak Hill and SEP as a small shareholding, so joined there as COO. Again, integrating some prior acquisitions and building organizational capability and strength for an exit. And we sold Pulsant to Ontan Infrastructure Partners around late summer last year. And then I joined what is now Red Helix, LDC backed. So, I've had the opportunity to do multiple exits, and I would say everyone I've learned something new on, but I've been able to take that into the next company. So I really spent my career looking for opportunities to use that experience with PE-backed organizations and really think about what my role is as COO in driving value for the private equity shareholders.
Okay, so it's the way you describe it. I'm sure it was not quite as smooth as you described it, but so in terms of what you bumped into along the way, challenges, etc. Would you describe them as just standard career type challenges, or were you aware in the IT industry that, being a female, you were in the minority and were therefore perhaps treated differently on occasions? Although, as I say, it sounds that you've been treated respectfully because you've ended up being top of the pile, whereas a lot of people talk about this sort of glass ceiling beyond which women maybe aren't always allowed to go. So just thoughts as to what you've encountered along the way.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I've been very fortunate that I've had some fantastic leaders and managers along the way to help me in my career. And now part of that is because of the organizations that I've chosen to go and work for. I've tried to find companies that share common values with me, and so I've been very lucky in that sense. But some of that is luck that I've made myself because of who I've chosen to work with. But having said that, I have encountered people occasionally who would simply dismiss my opinions quite publicly, and would shoot down ideas that I might put forward. And at times, I think as a female, we tend to take those things much more personally. And it can, if you don't learn how to build resilience to that when you're in the room, it can quite easily cut off your input, and therefore diminishes the value that you bring in those types of meetings. And you know, like most females, I've been in a meeting where people have looked at me as the person who's going to go and get them the cup of coffee. And there's nothing more disarming than actually getting the cup of coffee and sitting down and then opening with the killer line of, you know, wherever the meeting's about, and you sort of see the recognition on someone's face of the error and judgment that they've made. So that there are still a lot of biases in the tech industry. Generally, I think it is getting better. And I think as you encounter that as a female, one of the things I've learned through my career is to build your resilience to that and try and find a way to not take it and not internalize it and not make it personal. I'm sure it's not intended that way, but that's certainly how, as a female, it can often be received. And I think if you can build your resilience to it and continue with your point and continue to make your voice heard, you can overcome that challenge in the room. I think if you leave the room not having done that, you've lost the opportunity, because you don't get the chance to go back and reset people's views of a meeting that you've just left.
And you mentioned partly you say you've been lucky, but also partly you sort of did your research, if you like, on who you wanted to work for. So was that, I mean, was it because you networked with people, so you knew people in the companies you're going to work for and, you know, trusted them and admired what they were doing and wanted to be part of that? Or did you sort of carry out sort of due diligence, you know, try and investigate, look at websites, company reports to try and absorb what culture there was before you made? Just interested how you made those decisions.
Yeah, a bit of both. So I always ask, you know, part of my interviewing of a company that I'm considering joining, I always ask about, you know, how many females do you have in the business? What kind of roles do they take? You know, what kind of programs do you have to support females' progression in the business? You know, what are you doing around STEM, engagement with community, etc.? So I ask those questions to establish either does the company have a track record in doing that, or do they have aspirations and maybe don't know quite how to start it? Because that, you know, I'm okay if they don't have a well-fleshed program, as long as they're open to that kind of thinking, and that's part of the value that I can bring for them. So that's part of my research, is that type of questioning. But I think LinkedIn is an amazing tool when you're doing research on companies. You know, the 3 or 4 degrees of separation. You will always find someone in your network that is connected to someone that is connected to the company that you're considering. And so I use my network a lot in that way to say, you know, can you make an introduction to me to this person who's inside the company, and sort of do my own diligence with people who've either historically worked there or still work there, to try and get a view from the inside in terms of what organizations are like, and how their you know, what their culture is towards females in the workplace. So I think it's a combination of using your network, but also doing your research and not being afraid to ask questions of a prospective employer of how they help women in careers in their companies.
And just one more point on that. Were you always able to work out whether, because I mean, diversity, a bit like sustainability, there's a lot of lip service paid to it, and then the reality might be a bit different. So were you ever sort of disappointed when you arrived, having been told a load of things it didn't quite happen, or were you able to pretty much understand? Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. I think it's getting harder with a lot of messaging out in the public domain. I think it's getting harder
pay lip service, but because there is a lot available in the public domain in terms of how organisations think about their policies towards women and flexible working. And I see flexible working not just as a female thing, I see it as a people thing. Why should we think of those policies as being female friendly? They're just people friendly. And so it is becoming easier to spot the lip service. And I have, I did a very short stint at one company that was incredibly male dominated at the top, said all the right things during the interview process, but fundamentally at the C level, they didn't believe in it, and they were never going to. They were never going to, without changes at the C level, they were never going to advance and deliver the aspirations that they'd set out. And so I spent a very short space of time there and quickly moved on. And I think that's important as well as you're building your career, is, you may make mistakes, and that's okay, but learn from them. Don't feel like you've got to stick with it. You can afford a couple of short blips in a long career, and that's okay.
And in terms of the fact, I mean, you've clearly got into senior positions within organisations. So I'm interested to, do you feel an obligation to sort of improve the workplace when it comes to diversity and equality because of the journey you've come on, or do you just think that, it should be happening anyway? Or say, do you feel the sort of extra pressure because of the journey you've been on to help those that sort of follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word pressure, but I certainly feel a responsibility to do that. And I think I don't feel that sense of responsibility just around diversity in terms of the male-female mix. I think diversity generally, whether it's gender, whether it's race, neurotypical versus neurodiverse, I feel a responsibility across all of that, actually. And I think the journey that I've come on helps me be a great ambassador across that whole spectrum. And I do feel, a real sense of responsibility. Every organisation that I've gone into, it's a passion that I carry with me. Is what can I do in this company to further the agenda? So yes, I'm joining companies that already have that thought process and may well have policies, etc. But a big part of what I think about is what can I do to further advance that. There's still an awful lot to do in those areas. So being an ambassador and an advocate in every organisation is a really important part of what I pick up in the roles that I elect to take.
And just as a matter of interest, do you think when it comes to making these changes, is it helpful to do them in a sort of what I call a soft way, so that it's not sort of in people's faces, but you just sort of under the radar, if you like, I'm making changes that bring this about? Or do you think there is a place for some big and bold side of, we're going to employ so many women, I know quotas, but or at least ensure that, say, on a application, a job application, we're going to get at least as many women as men turn up to the interview to try and help that present. Just thoughts as to what needs to be done.
I think setting internal objectives around that, I think, is really important, because it does focus the mindset, and I think it focuses the mindset not just from people inside the business, but also as we work with different recruitment organisations, etc. I think it sets the right tone. What I don't subscribe to, as you said there, is setting quotas. I think you always want to bring in the best person for the role that you're hiring for, and you want to bring someone in that shows a real aptitude, a real passion for advancing in the role. And you always take the best person out of that mix. But I think getting a real mix of candidates, our organizations do need to challenge ourselves to get better at getting that mix. I would say right now in our recruitment, over 80% for some roles, 100% of what we see are male applicants, despite our best efforts and our targets to say, right, we want to target, at least a third of the applicants being female. And it's really difficult to achieve that, actually. And that tells me that as an industry, we've got to do a lot better in attracting diversity coming in, because it doesn't exist today.
And in terms of attracting that, I mean, a lot of people I've talked to point out the obvious that, the education system, if you like, the supply chain there needs to pull its socks up, if you like. But do you think there are sort of industry initiatives? I know there are some out there, but do you think the industry as a whole needs to get much better at encouraging people maybe who already started a career somewhere, but thinking of coming into the IT space and creating programs to help that?
Absolutely. I think, if I look at what the government Kickstart program did during COVID, I thought that was an exceptional program. It afforded people who had never thought about IT as a career. Now, I know Kickstart wasn't aimed at IT, but what we did with that program is we went out and targeted young people, 18 to 25, that had never worked in IT. And some of them had some retail experience, etc. And we brought them in on the Kickstart program, and we were able to let them experience a few different roles in IT during that program. It was low risk for us because Kickstart was funded, as you know, through the government. And the outcome of that was we transferred those young people into IT apprenticeships. So it was a great way that was relatively low risk for us as a company to try bringing people that had no engagement with our sector, didn't even understand what our sector was, and we were able to bring them in, and we targeted specifically female and neurodiversity in that recruitment strategy, because those were the areas that I feel we're underrepresented or were underrepresented as an industry and as an organisation. So I think if we think about those sort of joined up industry and government initiatives going forward, I definitely think there's a lot more that we could do. We've got millions of vacancies in the IT sector. We've got to do something different to attract talent from other industries, perhaps industries that are in decline, and let people see the potential of the IT industry and try it for themselves to bring them in. And I think there needs to be more joined up thinking with government and industry to make that happen, actually. And you're right, it's not just about the schools, although the schools have a large part to play in it. My daughter, I have an 8-year-old daughter, and she was telling me very proudly that they're having some careers talks coming in, and it's the professions, right? And I said to her, who have you got coming in? And it was firemen, it was policemen, it was doctors, nurses, dentists, which is fantastic. And I said to her, do you have an IT leader coming in? And she said, no, that's really interesting. And so she went and asked her teacher, and her teacher's response was, well, that's not really a profession. And I thought, what a terrible thing to be telling a young 8-year-old girl that's not a profession. Of course it is. So I think there are things within the education system as well that need to be addressed, but it doesn't stop there. We've got to carry it through into young people and into attracting people from other sectors into the industry.
And in terms of the sort of the diversity, improving that, I'm just wondering, in the same way that sustainability, we've got the scopes 1, 2, and 3, so people are starting to look at their supply chains for environment. Do you think there's any merit in, or do you already do that when you're looking at your suppliers? Do you inquire at all about their sort of their diversity strategies, or at least try and become aware of what sort of values you think they have?
We do as part of our onboarding. We have a standard supplier onboarding process, and as part of that, we ask about diversity policies. And it's very difficult to mandate that, especially when you're working with some of the big technology vendors. But we do try. I think as an industry, that's an area we could probably do better on. And I think it's an area that is ripe for maturing in terms of making clearer some of the statistical reporting on that, because you do get, to your point earlier, you get a lot of companies that put nice words around their policies, but how do you really evidence that they're living and breathing those policies? And you can only do that by statistics and facts and figures and showing improvement year on year. And I think as an industry, we don't do very well on that. I think at a high level, you can see what's happening, but it's not always very transparent within organizations. And I think, particularly mid-sized companies, we could certainly do a lot better in making that progress much more visible.
And again, bear in mind where you've got to in your career. I think it was a recent Ernst Young report, I think I saw, that said that although women, I think, were beginning to get more sort of senior level roles, I think there was still a depressing lack of them at real board level. So is that something you think, just apart from the general diversity, are there things do you think that can be done? Clearly, I guess you can't, mandate or force companies to do it, but are there ways to encourage more enlightened thinking, shall we say, in terms of when it comes to that senior level?
Definitely. Like you, I read statistics that say, there's only, I think the Moody's figure was something like 26% of females hold board or C-level roles in the UK IT sector. We represent more than 50% of the population. We should have a higher representation at that level. I think what we've got to get better at, and I include myself in this, is creating more female role models at that level that show the art of what possible is. I think historically, people have seen the boardroom as the domain of males, and I think we don't have enough role models standing up in the industry for females. I think some of the women in tech type organizations are beginning to shine more of a light on that, but I think we could do more on that. I think also, a lot of boards are appointed in conjunction with private equity, and I think there's a lot more that private equity can do in terms of how they engage their searches, how they think about attracting more females into the boardroom to bring that diversity in thinking. There are statistics that show diverse boards perform better because you have a much more diverse group of thinking going on in terms of driving and generating growth for companies. So I think there's the role model piece, and there's also a bit for the private equity backers to think about how they attract more females up into the C-level.
And I'm just wondering as well, is the portrayal, because I guess a bit of a stereotype generalization, but the very characteristics you like that are admired in males to get to the top of a company, perhaps if they're seen in a female, they thought, oh, that's not particularly ladylike in inverted commas. Is there any of that? Do you think women are perhaps reticent to be judged as being a sort of Mrs. Thatcher type figure that's got to the top of the pile by climbing on top of loads of people, and whereas men are sort of accepting that hey, if I'm the macho man I've got there, then all power to me kind of things. Is that at all true or just not?
Absolutely. And I think, as I started early in my senior leadership roles, I was always very conscious that I didn't want to be seen as someone who was aggressive, as if aggressive is a bad thing, right? If you feel passionate about something, the line between pursuing your thoughts aggressively versus assertively. That there's a very fine line between those two things, and I think females do naturally step away from that aggressive pursuit, not because they're not capable, but because somehow when a female does it, it's seen as you know, the sort of the bossy label. Actually pursuing your agenda aggressively is good. You know, that doesn't mean you have to hurt people along the way. You've got to take people with you. But I think traditionally women have shied away from that, and I think because of that, whereas men don't, naturally men don't. These are learned behaviours from when we're children, right? And men don't. Men are able to, you know, clamber through and have a natural propensity to be heard. So I think that is a skill that that women have to learn. And you know, my hope is that the education system has changed drastically now, so that some of the young women coming through are not encumbered by that sort of early onset of role models of males and females that certainly I went through in the education system in the 70s and early 80s. I think it's moved a long way from then, but there is definitely a risk that women are always, or certainly I'm always conscious of. I can only speak from my experience, that I'm always conscious of not wanting to be perceived as a Margaret Thatcher, as you know, but equally I want to be heard, and I want to be, you know, I want to get my points across, but I also want to listen. I want to be seen as someone who's open to ideas, and you know, not you don't have to be dictatorial to lead.
Okay, now we covered some brilliant sort of topics and ideas from yourself. In sort of finishing, are there either, you know, what we've covered, one or two things you want to emphasize, or if you know, were magically in charge of the industry for a day and you could say, right, we're all going to do this, or stop doing that, just sort of thoughts as to, you know, what would really make a difference in the short or medium term, you think?
Yeah, I'd love to see the industry come together to attract more diverse talent, and I think, you know, as an IT industry, we definitely don't do enough of that. I'd also like to see more role models stepping forward, and I think I'd like to, you know, ideally I'd like to see more seats held by females, and I'd like us to be able to track those statistics accurately going forward. You know, how many seats on board are held by females, and is that improving? I think the other thing that's happening, you know, if you look at some of the perceptions of IT and the IT industry, that perception I had back in the 1980s is still there for many females coming out of school. And in fact, I was reading a statistic the other day that only 18% of new computer sciences degrees are held by females. And that's declining year on year, as is STEM subject by females. So there's a trick that we're missing through the educational process in terms of attracting talent. And you know, the IT industry has a huge array, it has a vast array of career choices. And I think as an industry, we've got to do better of articulating what those choices are. And it's not, yes, coding is a part of it. Yes, you know, deep technical expertise is a part of it, but those are not the only parts. You know, there is a vast array of career choices in the sector, and I think we've got to do better at articulating what those different choices and different career paths are. And I think affording people the opportunity to come in and try it, you know, creating opportunities where, like the Kickstart, where people are able to come in risk-free for them, risk-free for companies, and try different things, and you can build the passion from the inside as opposed to outside looking in, wondering what it's all about.
Yeah, I must say during the pandemic, everyone said the IT industry was the fourth emergency service. and you know, you see the ads on the telly, whether it's the Navy, the Royal Air Force, the Army, the dramatic, you know, we did this, we say,
Yes.
It strikes me that the IT industry could do something similar. You know, the whole of Manchester was about to lose its power, but you know, somebody heroically in a data center somewhere or whatever saved the day. Need to tell some more of those stories. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, at the time during the first lockdown, I was in the data center industry, and one of the biggest challenges that the IT industry had was, you know, providing sufficient capacity for everybody for home working. The majority of businesses would at any one time only have about 20 to 30% of their workforce working from home. If you translate the UK working population to move 100% to work from home, which is what happened, the capacity on the broadband networks was creaking at the sides, and you know, the use of collaboration tools such as Teams and all the online business systems, using that over home broadband in the first few weeks, I can tell you there were some hairy moments from the bandwidth providers, the home broadband providers, and the data center industry stood up. I can't tell you the hours. I mean, the guys in the data centers had the government letters that allowed them to move with kit to expand the capacity and keep home workers working, and really keep the UK economy operational, really. And you're right, we don't, you know, as an industry, we don't sing about that side of it enough. And you know, those things go on every day when you think about where IoT is heading, and what the role that IT is playing in the whole IoT thinking. You know, it's just an amazing place to work. And we don't, you know, there aren't those types of TV campaigns to help educate the masses as to what it's all about and why it should be attractive as a career prospect for them.
It's been brilliant to chat, man. I say we covered a lot of ground, but you shared some brilliant insights. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Brilliant. Great to speak to you. Thanks. Bye.